Greg, you touched upon it briefly, and I thought that should be a separate topic for discussion. But I think it's a fascinating thing to talk about. What really is safety? We have the orthodox view, and we have the emerging concepts, and we have all sort of confusion around what safety really means. I have lost interest in safety completely, but I think it would be a good place to begin to see what is your view on what is safety.
So I'm struggling my way through this at the moment because I'm trying to write a book on proving safety, and so the question is, what is it that we're trying to prove? What is that? So, and it's interesting because so if I go back to the start of the thought process, I guess. So I deal primarily with safety from a legal point of view, and the law doesn't define safety in the legislation, and it doesn't say you have to have a safe workplace. What it says is you've got to do everything reasonably practicable to ensure the health and safety of people and that they're not exposed to hazards. So that's fine. And then we run into this difficult conversation which says, well, and it's really counterintuitive that we can't say our organisation is safe because we haven't had an accident. And yes, I understand where that comes from. And so we've seen these slogans that says things like, safety is not the absence of negatives, it's the presence of positives, or safety is not the absence of accidents, it's the presence of capacities, a couple of the ones that I've seen. Except that if you think you've got capacities and positives and you end up killing two people, are you safe? It's an interesting question. At the same time, if you have a fatality in your workplace and you're prosecuted and you're found not guilty and you're found that you've done everything reasonably practicable, which happens, it's legitimate, are you safe in those circumstances? I don't know what it looks like. And safe is very subjective. We've all had that experience where we've been a passenger in a car, and it's been. We were in South Korea recently, and we were going from the airport to our hotel, and this taxi driver was doing 140 in an 80k zone. I didn't feel safe. The driver was perfectly comfortable and perfectly safe. So we get. There's lots of different ways to look at it. I think in that sense, safety is your archetypal wicked problem, and defining the way you define, typically the way you define the problem, and I think this works a couple of different ways in safety in particular, but as a wicked problem, the way you define the problem determines your solution for it. There's no one solution.
No.
So if you're going to build a bridge, there is one. There's the mathematics and the engineering rules don't change. Safety, depending on how you define the problem, depends on how you manage it. So if people are the problem, then the way you manage safety looks a bit different than if you view people being a solution. But I think what we're seeing at the moment in safety is that people's weddedness to their solutions is driving the definition of the problem. So, if I have a strong belief in behavioural-based safety, that's how I define what safety is. If I more down the safety differently path, we're seeing lots of organisations defining safety around human and operational performance and those sorts of things. That shapes what your view of how to solve it. Often your commercial interest in a solution may very often define what you think the problem of safety is. I think as a matter of intuition, safety has got to have something to do with freedom from harm. I think it has. If the more exposed I am to harm, the less safe I am.
Yes. Can I offer a view on this? Yeah.
Fascinated.
Yeah, so yes, freedom from harm, you're right, Greg, but what kind of freedom from harm? Because you could have you could. I mean, we have a very interesting situation in the oil and gas world, in the maritime world, and so on. That people are dying, people are committing suicides, people are becoming overly stressed as a result of accident, how they are investigated,
Yep.
as a result
Yep.
of how audits are performed,
Yep.
as a result of how inspectors come across so arrogant sometimes, not all of them.
No, no.
So, yes, you may not have physical injuries, you may not have oil spills, you may not have any sort of non-compliance, but what about this aspect
Yep.
of risk and safety, which is not talked about at all?
No, it's curious, isn't it? So we were talking on the drive last night that we had an inquiry into high suicide rates in the fly-in, fly-out mining industry, and one of the pieces of evidence in that inquiry was a Lifeline report, and that's a suicide helpline. And based on their reviews, one of the biggest contributors to mental stress in the mining environment are actually health and safety rules. So, yeah, you're right. But in this obsessive search to prevent physical harm, what other harms are we doing on the way through? I think that's a really important issue. And if I terminate a worker's employment in the name of safety, what have I done to that person and their family, and what have I done to the co-workers of that person? Have I improved their safety? Have I compromised it? Or is institutional safety, does that override the safety of individuals? That it's a messy political, social power structure question where safety sits, who gets to decide what is safe, what is not safe. But interestingly, none of that, it seems to me at least, that none of that is factored into the structures we have for measuring safety. So all our lead and lag indicators, they don't define what safety is. So if we're saying that one of the measures of safety that we have, a lead indicator, is closeout of corrective actions. Okay. What's that contributing in terms of your overall idea of what safety looks like? What's that contributing to? And who bears, again, to your point, who bears the brunt of that? So, you're an operational manager, divisional manager, you're coming up to the end of the month, you've got action items that are not closed out, that are unlikely to be closed out because you haven't got the resources to do it, but you know that the board's going to look at that number, and if your scorecard's orange instead of green, so what do? You just mark them all knowing that they're not. What does that do to your mental health and well-being? What does it do to the physical state of the workplace? I think it's one of the really interesting conversations. And I think in part, and I think you can get a bit too lost in the complexity sometimes, but I think in part the complexity around that question of what is safety continues to drive reliance on injury rate data as a measure of safety. Because again, intuitively, for most organisations, if we are not having accidents, we must be safe.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can discount the power of that argument too easily, I think. But we know, we just know all the history is there of organisations that are objectively safe based on injury rates time and time again, and you have a catastrophic event. And so A, prima facie you're not safe because you've had this catastrophic event, but B, the inquiry reveals that everything that sat behind that catastrophic event was inadequate anyway.
Yeah.
So the question of what is safe is a really problematic one.
And this is where I find Rob's work very, very powerful. Because yesterday, for example, just leaving Canberra, I had a meeting with a woman, and she told me a fascinating story about how often seafarers from the third world for example, from Philippines, from India, have to tolerate so much. Cruise ships, particularly, where you are expected to, you're sexually harassed, you're bullied,
Yep.
and the client comes first. Of course, you
Yes.
cannot challenge
Yes.
any sort of. There is no power balance at all.
No.
So you end up in a very tricky situation where a lot of people feel bullied, harassed, and all sort of things. How do you tackle that issue? Because clearly that is a safety issue, right? Clearly, I mean, you can give it any name: mental health. You can call it bullying, harassment. But at the end of it, there is no safety.
It's interesting.
I mean, you think about it: going on the bridge of a ship, taking the ship out, in busy waters after being sexually harassed or bullied.
Your mind's not on the job at all.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But we do that. We do that. Conditional is not the right word, but we frame the way we frame safety is different in my view. So we know, for example, in industries like the airline industry and rail industry, when they talk about safe operating, it's planes don't crash and trains don't crash. The fact that you have baggage handlers suffering musculoskeletal issues all the time doesn't get accounted for. So when you say Qantas is the safest airline in the world, it's the airline that has had the least number of crashes. Is that the same as saying it is the safest? I don't know.
Neither do I. No.
I understand. Look, if I'm a passenger of Qantas, what am I more interested in?
Yeah.
The plane flying and landing, right? I'm not turning my mind particularly to the state of the baggage handlers.
It's a bit like what gets measured gets managed.
Yeah.
Although it's a very
that's not even a measurement question, is it? That's a real public
what gets
perception
focused upon.
question. Yeah, what gets focused on. Yeah. So again, at the moment we have this. I'll probably really say this inelegantly, but in the last 2 years in Australia, the focus on psychosocial risk has just been enormous. And I'm really curious to understand, and it probably won't wash through any numbers for a while, but what does that mean in terms of physical safety? Is there a risk that we're actually got less physically safe workplaces now because of? I think it has to mean that. Organisations don't have this untapped or this infinite bucket of focus and energy. So if I'm focusing on something, I'm not focusing on something else. That, again, we mentioned in the last chat, the criticality issue is
absolutely.
important.
There was a time when process safety took up a lot of energy and a lot of resources in organisation. The new movement we are seeing is around the line of psychosocial risks. Yeah. But I think that holistic view on safety is by and large missing. That's how I see it.
Yeah. But I kind of, if I'm the chief executive officer or the chairman of the board of a Qantas or of a rail company or a high hazard operation, my number one priority and focus is to keep the planes in the air, the trains on the tracks, and the hydrocarbons in the pipe. And if some individuals get damaged along the way, the organisation will survive that. The organisation won't survive planes dropping out of the sky.
So, but isn't that an assumption that all that would happen only because the document is being complied with? My problem is that if you situate it within the context of psychosocial risks, for example, isn't that as important as anything else to keep the planes flying and the ships moving?
I think it probably is, and I think historically that has been looked at through the lens of fatigue in particular.
Indeed.
Not the more compounding effects around it.
I mean, this is where the whole notion of critical risks gets very interesting, Greg, because what is a critical risk at the end of it? How do you, just there's some very clear definitions around the consequence and likelihood of something
sure.
going wrong.
Sure.
And I agree with that. I have no problems with that.
Yeah.
But a system is only as good as the people's state of mind who are managing it
Yep.
at the time of the
Yep.
and I think that cannot happen in isolation from equipment and systems and so on. We have to take things in more totality, and it's interesting that with this new standard of psychosocial risk, for example, you will have a heightened awareness of this issue, but you end up in the same situation where you give the regulator a checklist,
Yep.
but no appreciation for what it actually feels and means when you go on the site and do a so-called investigation,
Yeah.
audit, or an inspection.
Yep. So here's a question for you then, particularly in larger organisations. Is there, I think there is, but is there a limit to an organisation's capacity to actually take account of all these considerations?
That's a really good question. And Greg, I have a slightly different view on this. I think we need to reframe this question a little bit, because let's face it this way: there are people who have good intentions, and there are people who will not have some
Yeah.
good. They're driven by other things.
Yep.
I think this question has to be raised at the level of individuals, not organizations. I think you have, and then from individuals, for example, when you go into an organization, you talk to people and you work out through those one-to-one conversations. Who are the people who actually care for these things? And I think from there, you spread it at the level of the culture of the organization. I don't know of another way of doing it. You start small, you identify pockets within the organization, and then you create the right culture, the right language, the right tone, the right kind of leadership. You cannot take this at the level of society or regulation.
No.
It's very difficult to achieve that.
Part of the problem you have there is, and particularly we're dealing with this in Western Australia at the moment, is that often the regulations stymie those sorts of efforts.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
But again, we talked about this in the same way that organisations are very reluctant to let go of process to free up the sort of thing that you're talking about. Societies are very reluctant to let go of regulation of things that they consider to be risky. We've had this enormous shift in safety regulation in Australia over the last few years, built predominantly on retributive justice. So this idea that somebody gets hurt in the workplace, somebody has to be held to account, and severely held to account. Once you've created that environment, the number of organisations that are willing to adopt the kind of approach that you're talking about is really restricted. And I think we're seeing a much stronger, so as you impose retributive justice at a social regulatory level, that's what you see in organisations. More rules, more compliance, more punishment, more discipline, more termination. And ironically, you're creating this system of more punishment with a view to improving psychosocial health, which really seems counterintuitive.
Can I offer a thought here? I think we. So my view is that, first of all, this idea that there is no. I mean, society cannot progress through the idea of retributive justice is, I think, stretched too far. That you can blame or you can learn, and there is no such thing like blame culture is a bit too naive, I think.
I think there is a middle ground there.
Absolutely. More than middle ground, I think one needs to accept from a cultural point of view that there is no escape from blame. It happens at the level of family, it happens at the level of an individual, it happens at the level of organization. There is no no road running away from that. And I think it has its place. So when there is an accident, there will be somebody to blame. We have not evolved through the Christian history and the Hindu history for that matter. that we will ever create a blame-free society. But I think in the day-to-day running of the organization, which is looking at things in a more prospective sense rather than reactive and reactionary sense, I think we can create a lot of positive energy. We can come to a more mature stage to say, actually, we can make some changes. We can go on board a ship, we can do an audit, we can do an investigation, and we can actually listen to people.
Yes.
But make no mistakes, Greg, that I make no mistakes at all that when there is a large scale catastrophe, there's an accident, there's an incident, there will be somebody to be blamed.
Oh yeah. We know.
And we have hard times with this contemporary thoughts coming to accept this idea.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit. So my point is, just to answer your question, I think there is room for both. There is room for both. Yeah. I mean, a lot of, for example, I told you, what is the point in pushing that captain to the limits that we don't want any inspections on the ship, that you have pushed him to the point that he has jumped from the ship, that we don't want any defects. I think that's a little bit going completely out of balance.
And we do see, and I think sometimes the overreactions are the bit that are quite difficult. So again, we had an inquiry into sexual misconduct in the mining industry in WA, and one of the recommendations that came out of it was to create, it was literally called a blacklist of people accused of conduct. So if they're accused of conduct, they go onto this blacklist, so if they leave the site, they can't be employed on another site. Now that really strikes me as a complete denial of any level of fairness and justice to anybody in those circumstances. But again, this is one of those really socially difficult conversations, and as a privileged white male, I always feel a little bit uncomfortable dipping my toe into this water. So I've got no, I won't say that, but the prevailing view is that if a woman says she's been sexually assaulted, we need to believe her, and I absolutely agree with that. We do. But there's a trade-off there. If that's the trade-off, then the justice for those people is that you have to compromise. I think you have to compromise the justice of other people, or the rights of other people, and and these things are never completely fair one way or the other. But that's another wicked problem.
Indeed.
And as soon as you start diving into these wicked problems, you realise the complexity of what you're trying to deal with. So, from a legal perspective, the solution is actually really simple. So legal regulation is very simple and straightforward. Understand the activities in your business, identify the hazards, the things that can cause harm, identify the risks, put in place controls, implement and enforce the controls, and do a system of review. That's a linear, mechanistic, very straightforward. But as soon as you peel away the surface of that, as we've talked about, and you say, well, let's start with identifying hazards. Okay. What if your hazards are in competition with each other? What if your hazard to prevent physical harm is in competition with the things that cause psychosocial harm? Where's the trade-off there? Because you don't get the trade-off option. So if somebody's lost a hand in a piece of machinery and the regulator's looking at it, they're not looking at it from the context of saying, oh, part of the contributor to that was the effort you're putting into managing psychosocial harm. And similarly, if somebody suffers a psychological injury due to disciplinary type processes, you don't get to trade that off and say, we're trying to ensure the physical harm of our people.
Yeah.
There's lots of compromise.
It is, and Greg, I think what you're saying is making so much sense to me. The only thing I would say is that there has to be a recognition that the loss of hand in this situation is partly the result of mechanical failures, but it's also partly the result of the state of mind of the person. And unless we look at it in a more prospective sense, to say, in a more holistic sense, to say that we need to address both. So no inspection should be done, no investigation should be done, no audit should be done to actually make a traumatized person more traumatized is I think it's a good place to begin.
Well, take this framework then. I have been told point blank by the regulator in 2 separate meetings involving matters where we have a person who is absent from work due to psychosocial reasons, okay, workplace stress, bullying, harassment. 2 separate cases. And we've been told by the regulator that because they've now very much put their arms around it as a health and safety regulator, we have to investigate these things as health and safety matters, irrespective of the wishes of the complainant. So you're taking a traumatised person, and we've already touched on this, but we know that there are lots of deficiencies in the way that organisations investigate safety incidents.
Correct.
And we know that lots of people don't even receive basic training in incident investigation, much less the nuanced how do I deal with a traumatised person type issue. So again, that's just another example, in my view, of how trying to do the right thing for safety can actually make safety worse. And there's no easy or neat answer to it.
No.
And I think this is, again, goes to the essence of the work I'm doing now in terms of saying, if you're trying to prove safety, what is it that you're trying to demonstrate? And what are the trade-offs associated in that conversation?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Yes.